Have you ever done something that you were determined was a good idea at the time, but then you quickly decided after you collided with something that it probably wasn't the best idea? For example, I tried making a parachute and jumping off something quite high. I collided with the ground. Changed my perspective on using plastic bags as a parachute. My friend, if you guys have heard this illustration before or the story before, I'm probably going to tell it again because it's just so funny to me. My friend Michael came and saw me one day, and he had this huge lump on his head, big red mark. He had decided that he was going to make a homemade catapult. You guys are seeing where this is going. So he set, like they have on cartoons, you have the big rock in the middle, the board he found, you place one rock on one side, and you jump on this side. Accurate catapult, until it hit him in the head. And he woke up outside, plastered with this giant, he pretty much pulled a David and Goliath on himself. That collision with the rock radically changed how he viewed catapults again. They are dangerous and should be left to professionals. See, God seems to ordain collisions to radically transform political and spiritual landscapes. See, Daniel received a vision in the 3rd year of Belshazzar in Daniel chapter 8. So Daniel chapter 8. He receives a vision a few years after his last one that really spooked him. And he receives this vision, and it's about the year 550 BC. And this vision, this prophecy that he gets, does not come into play, does not happen for about 300 more years. And the detail that this played out is remarkable. We're going to see that here this morning. This vision that we're going to see in Daniel chapter 8 is broken down into 2 separate sections. There's sort of 2 aspects of this prophecy. The first time we're going to see this collision of 2 powerful nations represented by 2 different animals. And second, we're going to see the collision of a man who goes head to head with the Lord and his people. And what's really fascinating, the name of the sermon is called Numbered. God has this entire this entire layout planned by the day of how long this lasts. He numbered it. He called it. It was like, those sort of, not a raffle. It might be a raffle, but you sort of like, my college, you picked a day, the first day was going to snow, and whoever picked the first day was going to snow was going to get some prize to Applebee's or something like that. And so being from Colorado, I always picked, the 1st of October, and then it never snowed till November. And so whoever picked that date did. What God did is, okay, this is going to happen on this day, and exactly 2,300 days later, this is going to happen. He called it. He completely planned out this collision. And so we're going to watch this collision play and see how God numbered it and timed it. So the first we have is the collision of kingdoms. So if you guys are there in Daniel chapter 8, let's start reading verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after that which appeared to me at the first, and I saw in the vision. And when I saw, I was in Susa the citadel, which is in the province of Elam, and I saw in the vision, and I was at the Ulai canal, and I raised my eyes and saw, and behold, a ram standing on the bank of the canal. It had 2 horns, and both horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. And then I saw the ram charging westward and northward and southward, and no beast could stand before him. And there was no one who could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased and became great. And as I was considering, behold, a male goat came from the west across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground, and the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came to the ram with the 2 horns, which I had seen standing on the bank of the canal, and he ran at him with a powerful wrath. And I saw him come close to the ram, and he was enraged against him, and struck the ram and broke his 2 horns. And the ram had no power to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled on him. And there was no one who could rescue the ram from his power. Then the goat became exceedingly great, but when he was strong, the great horn was broken. And instead of it, there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. What is this? A National Geographic show, or what are we watching here? I mean, just imagine how this plays out. You have this one animal over here, 2 horns, big, strong, sort of weird and lopsided with the horns, but strong, and nobody can stop him. He just clears the way of everything. And as Daniel's watching this play out, he looks over, and here is another animal comes flying in with 1 horn. Boom! Takes them out. It looked like this animal actually had something against him. Had a chip on his shoulder. It says he was enraged against him. It wasn't just 2 animals colliding. This one animal hated the other one. And after he defeated him, he then smashed them and stepped on him and crushed him. What in the world's going on here? So look a little bit further. 19, verse 19. And he said, behold. So like I said, remember how it's broken down into 2 pieces? What we're doing is we're bringing the translation, the interpretation of this into it so we can actually understand this a little bit better, all right? So he says, behold, I will make known to you what shall be at the latter end of the indignation. For it refers to the appointed time of the end. And as for the ram that you saw with the 2 horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia. And the goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn between his eyes is the first king. And as for the horn that was broken, in place of it, which 4 others arose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power. So, so you have the first, the king of Media and Persia. You heard of the kingdom of the Persians. They're actually made up of a very powerful alliance between the Medes and the Persians. And one was stronger than the other, but then the other one grew more powerful and actually took over the one. That's how it actually played out. So let's see if we got this cool map with the collision of kingdoms. Yeah, haha. Okay, so hopefully you guys can see this. You know, one of these days I'm going to invest in an awesome super map program, and we will have perfectly matching maps all the time. But you have the kingdom of the Persians. There's Egypt, there's the Nile, there's Israel, okay, Nineveh, Babylon, Iraq, Afghanistan, right? Iran. Maybe the other way around. I forgot. Okay. You have India. There we go. We can start with there. Oh, I just went blank on which country goes where. Okay, so you have Greece, Assyria, the Medes, and the Persians. And right here was this empire that started. And they actually spread this way and all the way here. Around the entire known realm, the Medes and the Persians spread out. This is where when the prophecy talks about this animal with the 2 lopsided horns, it is referring to the Medes and the Persians, which united together. And a few weeks ago, we learned that they actually went and took out the Babylonians. See, there's Babylon right there. Went and conquered this and spread, and even the Egyptians couldn't stand against them. They went everywhere. But what happened is they got a little cocky. You know, like powerful empires do. They got a little cocky, and they go over here, and they meet this group of people, the Greeks, who are made up of Spartans, Macedonians, Greeks, Athenians, and another one. And if you wanted to get into a fight with people, these were not the people you wanted to get in a fight with. You guys ever saw the movie 300? Stuff like that? I mean, this is pretty much the bad mamma jammas. They just liked to fight people. It didn't matter who you were. The ladies, the moms and the wives would actually send their families out. And if their son or husband came back, in any way had retreated from the battle, they would kill their own husbands. They didn't joke around, okay? Even the women got in on it, okay? This is how bad it was. So they just fought. Well, Persians were like, yeah, we're invincible, and they attacked there. Well, they were able to work some deals and stuff, and they were able to conquer a little bit of land. But all they did was they made them really, 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 really mad. And out of nowhere, this little group called the Macedonians, this guy named, well, I'm just going blank here. Not King Arthur. Alexander. Wow, guys, this is weird. Alexander the Great comes up, and he pretty much bands together his group, and they hated the Persians. Bad. And this enraged animal, remember how it's talked about this enraged one. It wasn't just two running into each other. It was I was considering a male goat came from the west across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground. And this goat had one giant horn between his eyes. And he stood and he ran at him in a powerful wrath. And he went and he was enraged and he struck the ram and broke it. He destroyed it. He comes flying through, and this is pretty much the empire of Alexander the Great by the time he was done. Within years, that's what he had done. There was nothing that could stand before him. Do you guys see how big this is? You guys see where Europe is and India, Africa? That was the size of his territory. He could have kept going, but as we said last week, his guys sort of mutinied against him, and they didn't like that. So you have Alexander the Great went and just took off and flew. But what ends up happening, though, is Alexander, he actually dies in the city of Babylon. So you have this one horn being pictured. Okay, now what happened? This one horn then broke off into how many pieces? 4. Alexander dies and leaves his entire territory to his little toddler son. Well, guys, being guys, they totally let that toddler son rule over them. Done. No more king. And it broke up into 4 kingdoms. You have the Seleucid kingdom, the kingdom of the Ptolemies, the Antagonists, and the Cassander right there, a little tiny thing. Okay, and then it broke off into other ones little as they went, because that's what typically ends up happening. So you have these 4 major kingdoms that played out. Well, so far, everything played out exactly like was predicted. You had 1 horn, became 4 horns. But now, do you guys remember reading one of these horns? There was another one that sort of grew. So there was no one who could rescue the ram from its power. It's great. Okay, look at verse 9. So, let me keep going with this thing. You guys tracking with me so far? So you had the Medes and Persians that got taken over by Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great went and took over an even larger area. Then Alexander the Great died suddenly, and the 1 horn broke off and became 4 horns. Okay, 4 major kingdoms. So the horns right now are representing kingdoms. You guys get that? The Medes and Persians, 2 kings. Medes actually got taken over by the Persians. They were super alliance. 1 became stronger. Alexander the Great was 1, became 4. Okay, you guys, all this is playing off. Seems like the animals represent kingdoms. The horns represent kings. Okay, you guys seen how this plays out so far? Okay. All right, so now we get to the second point. So this right here is the collision between kingdoms. They slam into each other. So that's the first collision that we witnessed. And now Daniel goes on, and what's happening in his vision is he actually sees another power struggle play out. There's one more thing, okay? So the Seleucid kingdom that started here, they actually went and right away they actually started taking over their buddies. And this is sort of where they ended, at the peak of their power. See, so they sort of disappear. You see how that happened? Like, oh, yay, we're so strong. No, you're not. We took it. That's sort of what happened, okay? That's how it played out, okay? And they became, this became the bulk of it. And then you have the Ptolemaic right here. And that was the other one. These were the 2 major powers. And then right here, the Roman Empire was just getting going. It was actually still the Roman Republic at this time. But everyone began to be fearful of the Romans that were coming. Okay, so that's how this thing plays out real quick. All right, so the second collision that we see is actually of powers. So not just kingdom. We actually see this collision of powers. And there's actually a real huge spiritual element to this. It's not just, we're mad at you, baya. It is actually, there's a spiritual element here that looks like, there's some, culture fighting, but there's also a spiritual battle that was playing out between this leader that comes up and the prince of princes. It says, out of one of them, verse 9, came a little horn. So remember, you have the 4 horns, and out of one of these horns rises another little horn. So it is like an antler. You know how they sort of spread out from each other? You have this one that's coming out, okay? And it grows toward the south, towards the east, and towards the glorious land. This horn is going everywhere on this animal. But he's taking over. So there's this little horn that's doing all this. And it grew great, even to the host of heaven. and some of the host and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. Let's keep going. So, do I want to read this all the way through? No. Okay, so a Seleucid king by the name of Antiochus IV, okay, came to power. Antiochus was a very similar name to a Caesar or a Pharaoh. He sort of took his father's name, and his father took, his father's name. So they took this, and it became known as the king of the Seleucids. And there was this guy that came out, okay, this king. And they were starting to fear the coming Roman Empire. And so he started doing a huge power grab, trying to get as much land as he possibly could to, in essence, create a buffer between the Roman Empire and his own place. Does that make sense? So they figured the more land I take, eventually, as the Romans took land, they would get tired of taking all the land, and they would just give up. So they started doing a power grab and expanding as fast as they could. Have you guys ever heard of the phrase line in the sand? It's actually based on this guy. And a lot of times I've heard a line in the sand as somebody keeps making a line and they erase it and changing it. I've heard of it used that way. Maybe you guys haven't, but I have. So somebody, line in the sand. Oh, you drew a line. Oh, changed my mind. And then they go like, oh, no, if you ever, cross this line, then I'll be mad. Oops, just joking. And made another line. So that's what it actually doesn't mean that. So this guy actually went into Egypt, trying to take, and he was trying to make an ally. And the Roman ambassador, this is like a side note, but the Roman ambassador came up and with a stick drew a circle around him in the sand. And he said this, he pretty much asked this question, are you going to fight the Romans? Yes or no? And he was like, well, let me think about it. He's like, you don't get to. If you step out of the circle, we're at war. He did this before his entire army. This one lone Roman ambassador drew the circle around the king of this empire and said, you leave the circle without your decision, it's war. He was so embarrassed, but he was so scared, he caved. So when you see a line in the sand, this is what it refers to. This guy got a little scared of the Romans, but for good reason. The Romans were bad mamma jammas. And so, side note, all right, let's keep going. All right, so verse 9. All right, so the Seleucid kingdom expanded, and there was you might have heard a phrase called Hellenization. I'm drawing some terminology. Hellenization is a process that they tried to force anybody and everybody they took over. They tried to force them to accept American culture, or not American, but you could actually attach that. Greek culture, Greek language, Greek religion. Very similar, just consider to what America does with anybody who comes over here. You better learn English, you better worship our God, and you better pay your taxes. We just sort of force it. Same idea, okay? But they did a little more extensive. And so they're forcing everybody onto this. Well, as you can imagine, some people didn't like that, especially the Jewish people. Because the last thing they wanted to do was ditch the language that they had for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And not only that, if they actually caved in and started worshiping the Greek gods, they would be denying their faith in the one true God. So there was some tension here between this group of Hellenized Jews and traditional Jews. So bad that they were going to actually start fighting. Okay, because one side didn't want to go, and you guys can see why. One side says, well, you're God, we're going to worship, pagan gods and stuff. And the other side's like, no, we're not doing that ever again. We got in trouble for doing that. We're going to worship the one true God. And so they're being forced upon you, and you have this debate. And so Antiochus is so infuriated by this line in the sand incident that he goes back to Jerusalem, and he is mad. And he just says, Judaism is banned. You cannot worship God. You can't. And he sets up, this is the Hebrew temple. He goes into the Hebrew temple, and he sets up an altar, a pagan altar to Zeus in the temple. I'm not even done yet. He then gets a pig. Okay, you guys know pigs are unclean animals? He gets a pig, This is in the temple, the holy temple, and slits the pig's throat and offers it to Zeus. Okay. How do you think Israel responded? They went nuts. You have this thing called the Maccabean Revolt, the Maccabean Rebellion. There's actually, in the Catholic faith and some of the other ones, they have the book of the Maccabees. It actually talks about the history of this. We don't believe it's scripture. We actually believe they're pretty accurate history. But that's what it's describing is this event, this rebellion, which lasted from 167 to 160 BC. So with that in the backdrop, let's keep reading, okay? So he goes, he becomes great. And some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. This is in reference to stars of heaven, sometimes refers to angels, but it also sometimes refers to just the people of God. And so by declaring and going to fight and started fighting the Jewish people, he grabbed some of God's people, threw them on the ground and trampled them. In essence, he started killing God's people. And he became great even as the prince of the host, and the regular burnt offering was taken away from him. Remember the burnt offering? We're going to worship Zeus. He stopped all worship to God. And the place of his sanctuary was overthrown, and a host will be given over to it together with the regular burnt offering because of the transgression. That transgression, that great sin. Some of you guys might have heard the phrase, the abomination of desolation. This is what it's referring to. Somebody, a Gentile, going into the temple and offering a pagan sacrifice to a pagan god with a pagan unclean animal, which caused, and it will throw truth to the ground, and it will act and prosper. And then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering? And so they're going to give something very specific here. It says, okay, so in this vision, the burnt offering has been cut off. How long will this take place? How long until it will be restored again, until we can offer sacrifices? It says the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot. So this is referring to this time of where Antiochus got into the temple and offered the sacrifice. And he said to me, 2,300 evening and mornings. That is literally 2,300 days. That's pretty incredibly specific, isn't it? That is about 6.3 years. You can count, you can probably figure out 352 divided by, yeah, you guys can do that, okay? But about 6.3 years. And it says, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state. The revolt lasted from 167 BC to 160 BC. 6.3 years. Because what ends up happening is as soon as he desecrated the temple, a large enough portion of Israel rose up, and they pretty much did guerrilla warfare. And they hid, and they fought, and they were secret. And so they fought this heavily armored, this heavily superior army with nothing but guerrilla warfare. They tricked them to head into swamps and areas where armor and horses and chariots and stuff couldn't work as well. And they would trick them to go there, and they'd fight and kill them, and they'd run off and scatter. And they could not pin them down. And so as a result, with the Maccabean revolt, they won. 6.3 years later, they finally defeated the Seleucid army. And they were able to march into Jerusalem, cleanse the temple, and start worshiping again like they should. This is all planned. This is all detailed 300 years before. And this is so detailed that there are scholars that say this could not have happened. It's too detailed. It's too specific. Well, it did happen, just like Daniel said it would. And the nation of Israel knew. Talk about being able to live out a prophecy of God. So let's keep going, verse 23. Let's skip ahead a little bit. All right, so at the latter end, okay, so let's do 22 actually, we'll do that. As for the horn that was broken, in place of which 4 others arose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power. And that's referring to nobody had the power of Alexander. They were less powerful. Okay? And then it says, and at the latter end of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their limit, a king of bold face, one who understands riddles, shall arise. His power shall be great, but not by his own power. And he shall cause fearful destruction and shall succeed in what he does and destroy mighty men and the people who are the saints. That's him. And by his cunning, he shall make deceit prosper under his hand, and in his own mind he shall become great. And without warning, he shall destroy many. Israel had no idea this was going to happen. They expected him and his army to head down to Egypt, start a great battle, win. The last thing they were expecting is him to come back with his tails between his legs and go crazy. But if you read up on him, he had mood swings harder than anything. And so he was mad, and he took it out. Now it says, by his cunning, he shall become great. So here's what's fun about him. So he, you guys might have heard, so he was an Antiochus, which is like a Caesar or a Pharaoh. And when he became king, he added Epiphanes to it, which literally means God manifest. So he is Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, which means he is king of the Seleucid army, the physical manifestation of God on earth. That's what his name means. And so when he went into the temple, he thought he was God. He got up there and offered this pagan sacrifice to an idol. He thought he was great. We can look at that. We can just stop right there. And we can sort of connect that, a little, not to the extent, but to how oftentimes Christians can feel when there seems to be collisions slamming against each other. It seems like there's always we're sort of like caught as innocent bystanders. You know, I mean, sometimes it's very specifically, targeted at us. Other times it's not, but we usually end up being caught, not usually, but at times we can get caught up in this. And we can look around and we can look at, the elections or laws or how history and how nations are starting to fight now. And it can honestly feel like the enemy is winning. We just get that feeling, like we can turn on the news and we're like, man, is there anything good left? Is there anything? We can get this feeling of despair and hopelessness. And it says in verse 27, I, Daniel, was overcome and lay sick for some days. This really bothered him because he saw his people being trampled on and destroyed by this person who rose up and offered an abomination in the temple. This guy here is actually, we'll find later, but he is a picture of how bad the Antichrist is going to be in the future. And we can get this feeling of hopelessness and like there's no chance of good winning. I just love how the Bible is written because it says he will even rise up against the Prince of Princes. So this guy rose up. He thought he was God manifest, and he rose up, and he committed just terrible acts to the Lord. It says, and he shall be broken, but by no human hand. So what happened to this guy? So he he didn't get in a fight. He didn't die actually in the battle of this revolt. A few years later, in about 164, so 167 BC, pig, whole abomination, desolation. A few years later, this army rises up over on his east side, okay? His east is boundary. And so he got his army and he headed over there because, the Jews weren't really worth it. So he headed over there to fight them. And he goes and he's thinking, all right, he's going to defeat them. And then out of nowhere, he pretty much dies. There's really not a lot of information, but he just got a disease and died. His time was up. And then as the Seleucid Empire was paying attention to this army that just out of nowhere rose up and started to attack, the Jewish people, the Maccabean revolt, was able to continue to take it and actually take their land and secure freedom. See, it can look like evil's going to win. But God has it taken care of. See, no matter how bad it gets for Israel, verse 25 would be their encouragement. He will be broken, but by no human hand. God had the days of the wicked numbered. And he has numbered the days of our suffering. And in any situation, God has ordained an end to wickedness and evil. He just hasn't told us the exact amount of time. He has it numbered. He has it all figured out. He knows exactly when the evil in the world is going to stop and when it will be judged and how things are going to play out. He knows, and he has it numbered. Just like he showed here, 2,300 days from the time that this happens until you guys get to walk back in there. I have it numbered. I know exactly when the nation is going to revolt, and I know exactly when it is going to end. I have the days of evil numbered. And we can trust the Lord through this. Now, Nahum chapter 1, minor prophet. Chapter 1 says this: the Lord is a jealous and avenging God. The Lord is avenging and wrathful. The Lord takes vengeance on his adversaries and keeps wrath for his enemies. The Lord is slow to anger and great in power, and the Lord will by no means clear the guilty. His way is in whirlwind and storm, and the clouds are the dust of his feet. He rebukes the sea and makes it dry. He dries up all the river. Bashan and Carmel wither. The bloom of Lebanon withers. The mountains quake before him. The hills melt. The earth heaves before him. The world and all who dwell in it. Who can stand before his indignation? Who can endure the heat of his anger? His wrath is poured out like fire, and the rocks are broken into pieces by him. The days of the wicked are numbered. Just like this little horn. This Antiochus the fourth, God manifest, put that in quotes. His days were numbered. He continues, the Lord is good, a stronghold in the day of trouble. He knows those who take refuge in him. But with an overflowing flood, he will make a complete end of the adversaries and will pursue his enemies into darkness. See, God is fighting for us. And we can trust him because he has the days of the wicked numbered. And so we can